Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Ed Collab Fall Gathering. Thank you so much for joining this session, Regaining Reading Readiness, Inspiring a Lifelong Love of Reading and Sharing Stories. You are going to be hanging out with myself and Janet Damon, my colleague and friend from Denver Public Schools. So we'll just take a few moments to introduce ourselves. Janet, do you want to go first?
Sure. So my name is Janet, and I'm the Library Services Specialist for Denver Public Schools, and just enjoy and I'm so thrilled to talk about and to share just ways to celebrate and to regain reading readiness with you, Julia.
Yeah, I'm always excited to be able to be with you in any capacity. And it's wild that we're in the same city and like the same district, the same locale. You're probably just down the street, but we are virtually in our different settings. But I'm grateful to be able to share this space with you. If you hear anything that we say that you like or that resonates with you, please feel free to add the Twitter tags at Julia Aaron 80 or at Mix Mama. And please hashtag everything with the Ed Collab Gathering so that we can be a part of the community conversation. So let's jump right in. Let's go back and just talk a little real quickly about the books that we put and why. We decided to put up a couple of books that were just top of mind and just ones that help us regain reading readiness, or even just that, we could be ready to read at any time. And I wanted to talk just quickly about Their Eyes Were Watching God. I know that folks probably are familiar with that one, but as I've been doing a lot of thinking about the classics these days and what really defines a classic, that book to me would definitely be considered a classic. And I love the way that that book gets into both the intimate and individual experiences of Black American women, and then also the collective experience. So I like the way that it goes back and forth between the personal and the collective. And then for Ways to Make Sunshine, who doesn't love Renee Watson? And I just want to say that that book is just one of those that I think you can share that story with the young people in your life, or even just read it for yourself when you need to pick me up. And there are more stories that are being written about Black girl joy and Black boy joy, but I think that that one is just one that is so uplifting, and it's just a beautiful thing. And they say that spreading joy can be a spiritual practice. So I absolutely love Ways to Make Sunshine as well.
I love those. I love how and why you chose them too, Julia. For me, I am lately thinking a lot about reading as a source of inspiration and transformation. And so I've been centering a lot of poems and poets, and Nikki Grimes' Ordinary Hazards. There are so many poems in which I see the celebration, the curiosity, also the complexity of Black women's lives and their childhoods. Also, I keep Black Girl Call Home by Jasmine Mans kind of like right here at my desk, because sometimes I need to nourish myself with a poem, and this is a place that I come to get that nourishment. And so I sometimes will send a little poem to my daughters, to my friends, to let them know, like, I want to feed you in this way, I want to celebrate you. So that's why I chose those.
I love poetry, and I'm so glad that you picked those two. Those are awesome, awesome titles to kick off our presentation today. Yeah. So we're going to jump right in and talk a little bit about validating and enabling text. That language, of course, comes from Alfred Tatum, who we are very lucky to be able to call a Denverite these days. He is at Metropolitan State University of Denver. So we'll just share this little quote from him. He says, instead of trying to score with reading, schools have focused on increasing reading scores. And I just want to start there, because folks are already talking about how we just barely came back to in-person schooling from pandemic times. And there is a focus or overemphasis on testing and achievement. And there's a lot of conversation about learning loss and, getting certain scores. And, I want to make sure that we remember that we are here, Janet and myself, to help folks remember the human side of things and how important it is to help our young people gravitate toward reading and books that connect with that human part of who they are. Do you have anything that you wanted to add? Janet?
No, I just have always, I think his work is phenomenal. And just looking at our lineages, our textual lineages, our literary lineages, the ways that we find ourselves in stories, and that these stories help to make us who we are and give us the language of that. So I think that anchor in just why and the purpose of reading, and how that is an engine for driving, and gaining just that love, that lifelong love of reading.
I appreciate that. Absolutely. So we know that there are these pedagogical and theoretical considerations, but also there are some practical considerations. Our students need to have their realities validated, and they actually deserve to have their realities validated. So we don't just come up with this idea that it's someone else's world and we're just living in it. We deserve to find stories that will validate our experiences and, just what we know to be true. We know that youth belonging to the dominant culture often have their realities constantly validated. And one thought that I have when we think about that is the fact that, recently I was playing Supernatural on this thing called, and it's like a workout game. And it's a game, but it's also a workout program, I guess. And I was doing it on this thing called the Oculus, which is a virtual reality headset. And I got an email that said, join our Oculus community. And as soon as I looked at all of the faces, it was a collage of all of these faces that they had pulled from all of these users who are supposedly part of the Oculus community. And every single one of them was white. And I did not realize that was like the world that I was living in, because I don't really connect with other users. It's just like me in my own little virtual reality exercise world. But that's kind of what it's like, I think, sometimes when we go out in the world and we are led to believe anyway, that what is representative of an experience or a story or a narrative is a bunch of white faces or a bunch of white experiences. And so then what happens? Folks who belong to what Montessori for Social Justice calls the people of the global majority wind up being othered. And there's this false idea that we are the minority and not the majority, which globally we are the majority. Mm-hmm. So, I just wanted to put that out there so that folks could kind of understand a little bit of what it's like when that othering happens at the movies, on Amazon, with the shows that you're given to look at on Netflix. I mean, just so much of a dominance of one culture, whether that's true to what reality is or not. And then, of course, stereotypical depictions of identities can undermine the actual lived experiences of our students. And I know that before, when you and I spoke, you had some really powerful things to say about that. Do you want to add on?
Sure. I think that when we think about anything, when we think about stereotypes, these are constructs that are created that serve kind of this purpose of putting forth one identity as having a lot of value and another identity as not having a lot of value. And that can be really insidious because it legitimizes negative policies and practices and reinforces that some people are deserving and have the right to be centered in stories, and others are marginalized and they don't have their stories centered. But I think that when we think about the actual experiences of our students, both from the global majority and both from the dominant culture here, is that our lived experiences are so nuanced and they're so intersectional that they're also robbed. When a stereotypic character is put forth, they're robbed of the experience of really seeing a genuine reflection of themselves as well. And so I think that's why, when we really want students to build connections across culture and identity, that having stories that really are rooted in real life, lived experience, that is intersectional in nature, that is truly genuine and authentic, it allows them to have so many access points that help them to build connections in text and also in life.
I love that. In text and also in life. Feel free to tweet that out. Janet Damon. Hashtag the Ed Collab. Okay, so here's a slide that just gives a little bit of information about what happened when we did an audit. And Janet, will you tell us a little bit more? I think this was done at the district level.
Yeah, well, we have an incredible team. This one, I think, I'm not sure if this is the one that we did at our district level or if this is some information that was done at another school that shared it with us. But our library services team has an incredible collection development team. And so Susie Tonini, Terry Faulkner, Lori Micho, and Amanda Samland do an incredible job auditing and examining and doing this work of looking at our collection with a critical lens. And so they gather data and they look and make sure that we have a representation across identities. And we could talk a little bit more, I think, in the next slide. But yes, so this work is a cornerstone of our department's approach to equity and representation in collections and in our digital resources as well.
And I would encourage folks to reach out to their library services, their district library services, and ask them if this work is already happening, because it might be. And, you know, it's important to just take a look at these categories that are listed out here. This was part of a larger project, which was our culturally responsive librarianship pilot, where we did an audit. Everyone did audits at their school level, and then we looked at, you know, patterns and things at the district level. And then we would meet periodically. And one of the things that I'm so grateful for is that the collection development specialists, they would create these carts that would, and of course they wanted us to contribute as well, add some titles, take a look at the author. Then there was a drop-down listing for multiple categories, going back to that piece you were talking about in terms of intersectionality. And, you know, is this an own voices text, which that's a whole nother conversation, but that's something that still really matters to me. And then is it an enabling or validating text? And then also a rationale for why this would be a good one to include in someone's equity cart. So this is something that we did as a group, and then individuals did, and then also our district leadership did. So highly recommend that folks do this type of activity with one another to just get familiar with all of the text. Because one of the questions I think librarians get a lot is, you know, how can we get lists of titles? Because folks can't read all of the books. I mean, there's a lot of books that are produced and written every year. So I think it's really important to do this collectively and to think of the work as something that you can also do with your students when we're thinking about reading readiness. I love giving stacks of books to young people and then asking which of the books are the most appealing, which would you recommend to other people, using that feature of having them review and rate books within Destiny for folks who have Destiny. And then also I really enjoy just the opportunity to have them do the book talking and like sell the books to one another. I think that's a great way to start off the year. I read this book last year and I loved it, and I want to share this with you. Those are some really great ways, I think, to kickstart reading readiness and to include the new text that you might be considering for curriculum adoption if people are doing that as well.
I love that, Julia, because what it centers is our identity as readers, right? Like if I know my identity as a reader and I know the text that I would recommend to a friend, and when I have that kind of relationship with my reading, with my books, and then it's like sharing a well-loved colleague, classmate, friend with another student. And so I think too that like there's a power in reading through a part of your collection, a part of the books that you are curating, and asking yourself some questions around, does this have representation for our students who are gender expansive? Does this have representation? Because you could do your whole collection, but you could also do parts of your collection, right? Like you could look at, do I have representation in my STEM books? Like my, you know, are there scientists of all backgrounds who are represented? Is this showing up in, you know, the anime, the collection, and having students help participate in that process? I love that. So, yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Sure. There's a resource slide that you will have, and it has just some different resources that you could use and folks you can connect with. I have linked in a talk from Dr. John Powell, and he is with, he does a lot of work around belonging and othering, and leads a lot of work in terms of how this how we can uplift it, how can we can disrupt the practices and institutionalized examples of the way that othering has become so hardened and durable in so many of our systems. Dr. Nicole Cook is a leader in DEI work in libraries and inclusion. We also have some resources from Berkeley, the Greater Good Science Center. And so we know that having a practice of mindfulness and a practice of self-reflection also helps us to reduce the bias that we show up with. So that's just some resources. I have Cultivating Genius. Everyone should be reading Dr. Goldie Muhammad and putting these things into practice and looking at your work with this lens towards our children's genius and centering that. Teaching for Black Lives is an amazing resource, but also their website has tons of tools that you can use to build book lists and to look at some texts that we should be reading as educators for our own, learning agendas. We never stop learning. We always want to show up with the right tools and the right understandings and mindset to support students. The Reimagining Equity and Access from Project Ready is an awesome resource if you want to take some folks in your school or you want to share with your librarians. It has like modules and classes people can use for self-directed learning. And then Intersectional Allies is a book that I just love and adore right now because it, for young students, but also for our middle and high school students, it gives great examples of what it is to stand up for one another, to be in community with one another. And the authors of it, all three, they all have backgrounds in, in psychology and human development. So I think it's a great, great book. So those are just some resources, as well as a link to the American Academy of Pediatrics that is starting to really address how racism is a huge impact to our children, and how, one of the things I think of, Julia, is doing this work is that it's also a threat to us to have the internalization of these negative mindsets about ourselves. Like, so we are simultaneously holding both spaces, one that we're ensuring that students have access to representation of, Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, like windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, but that we also are holding and ensuring that we don't internalize some of these beliefs from dominant culture that of our lack. And so I think that work from our medical community to address that is pretty powerful.
Yeah, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I mean, I think that I've done just a little bit of research because our colleague and friend Caroline Hughes talked to me about reading trauma from Harvard and their brain research in the developing child. And so she didn't term it reading trauma. That was something that I thought about after the fact when she led me to research about the effects of trauma on the brain. And then I started thinking about what I was seeing in the library with respect to young people and how they were responding to the call to read when they would get invited to the library space. So I think you're absolutely right in thinking about again, the holistic or human aspects of things. We've got to think about pediatric research. We've got to think about scientific brain research. We've got to think about trauma-informed education and perhaps prioritize that. Not perhaps, but definitely, in my opinion, prioritize that over the achievement of certain test scores right now and really pushing people to, perform. Mm-hmm. I think that taking a little bit more care with our young people, especially considering that almost all of them just came from a year of no contact or little contact, little community, at least little in-person community. I think that's the direction that we need to be headed in. So we're going to shift gears just a little bit and talk about using story to teach craft. How can we teach with stories? We talked about Dr. Goldie Muhammad. She says we must start their stories and identities with their excellence. And of course, Black Boy Joy is a phenomenal example of that. We will shout out the professor, I don't know if he is or not, but I'm gonna call him that, Kwame Mbalia. who spearheaded this project, Black Boy Joy, because it's full of stories of exactly that. And in the same way that Ways to Make Sunshine is just uplifting and maybe can serve as a healing reading practice or reading experience, I believe that Black Boy Joy and other stories of excellence can do that too. All right, so some practical considerations. We want to consider interdependence rather than dependence. So are you always the one who's handing out the next book that the student is going to challenge themselves with, or are they recommending books to one another? Are they finding ways to build true, authentic reading communities by doing the book reviews, doing, conversations about books that are authentic, such as lit circles and reading clubs. I've been doing a lot of conversation with my students at Metropolitan State University who are pre-service candidates about how to do book clubs with students. Everybody can't do lit circles for budgetary reasons, for curricular reasons, but I do think that we have more success when students are able to choose the text that they want to read and then also support one another in their growth as readers, rather than constantly looking to the teacher for that validation or that grade or that, reward for the performance of a certain task. And then what text do students read to make meaning of the world around them is a really big question. Some of my students are very into this one book called The Black Hand that is about narcotraficantes in Mexico, I think. So, it's really interesting how they are making meaning of the world around them by pursuing their interests. And we need to keep an open ear for what their interests are and then help them find the people and resources that are going to stoke those natural fires of curiosity. And then also, how can we vary form to match function? I love what you were mentioning about podcasting, Janet, because I think that we've got some cool student-led podcasting going on here in DPS. And I do think that writers make art in a lot of modalities. Typically, writers can also be visual artists. They can also be musicians. They can also be, even scientists or engineers. So talking to folks about how their reading and writing is an extension of the lives that they're already leading outside, I think that's an organic way to help guide them toward reading that will excite them. Do you have thoughts to add?
I do. I think that, and because when we get those touch points are springboards for me for research. And when we think about, especially like the students who are interested in the narcos situation, or a student who is interested in podcasting and doing this work, like when we think about this kind of life cycle of learning, right? Like where students are tapping into their curiosity, there's a topic, maybe it's like medical apartheid, right? Like there's this amazing book about, the dark side of science and how that works. Then to kind of use that as a springboard to say, let's get into some, research around how this has impacted our communities. How has this impacted us historically? And so then it's like reading for both my interest and my curiosity, but also how do we transition that to my activism, my service, my social action research. Talk to 7 members in your community or your family and ask them, did they know about this? And share with them some of the resources they can tap into to learn more. I think students love just becoming really experts, but also like I think about that competence precedes confidence when we think about Dr. Yvette Jackson's work around students' genius, going back to Goldie Muhammad. Like all of it is this life cycle of learning where I'm soaking up and I'm following my curiosity, and then I'm using that to learn more about things that interest me. And now how do I carry it forth into sharing my knowledge through podcasts, or using that to support my community to understand things with deeper awareness. So I think all of that is just amazing.
I couldn't agree more. Here is just a very quick example of a lesson that we did in one of my classes where we learned how to break the rules of the quote unquote rules of grammar or writing for intention. So this is just an example of an activity where students were put in the position of being the teachers to one another. And, you know, some folks might say, well, what are you doing then if you're having the students teach each other? But at the same time, I was always taught that you really do own knowledge that you then share with someone else. So of course, I talked about the examples and non-examples of grammar and grammatical rules, but then we also talked about when some of our favorite writers would break the rules intentionally. So something that we can do is bring in the books that students love to read or that they're enjoying reading, just that they have chosen, and ask them to look for examples of writerly moves that folks have made that they want to then incorporate into their own craft.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
All right, and here is Janet and myself sitting in our lovely living room. This is an example of this is another resource slide. I am on a campus right now that has 5 schools, technically 3 middle and 2 high schools. And that will be disbanded here at the end of the year. But one of the things that I have learned is that there is a lot of strength that can come from consistency, and then also from folks who are at a technically older age and a higher grade level, sharing their knowledge, their passions, the books that they love with younger students. I think that if we can, because most of our school models, unless you're in an independent school or in a building that houses the 6 through 12 type environment like I have right now, a lot of times, you know, it can be separating or I don't want to say divisive, that's too strong, but we can get into these age groups where the high schoolers don't want to have anything to do with the middle schoolers anymore because they're technically in another building down the road and they don't really have much connection with each other. So I just want to shout out some of my students who are upperclassmen or upper class people who that sounds so strange, who are in the upper grade levels that have supported their 6th graders who have come into the building and supported their reading choices. Also want to shout out Book Love Foundation, Follett for giving me the opportunity to talk with Jason Reynolds. We had a conversation called The Language of Liberation, Books as Bridges. I believe it's still available. It was from a year ago, but it's still good. I believe that the ideas are still strong. So please feel free to check that out if you would like. Disrupt Text is a collective that I am a co-founder of that focuses on facilitating conversations around the literary canon, but then also what books we consider worthy of academic study in schools. And it's an ongoing, evolving conversation. You'll get the opportunity to hear from another of our co-founders, Lorena Germán, at the end of this day of gathering. She is the end of the day keynote speaker. Mm-hmm. And then there are 3 books in front there, Stamped, We Are Not From Here, and Lifting as We Climb, Black Women's Battle for the Ballot Box. Those were my faves from 2020 in terms of books that I think really made their mark and challenged the status quo, challenged the way that we might consider teaching history and the present. We Are Not From Here is fiction, but that book is so powerful. I really feel like folks need to consider bringing that into curriculum as much as possible. I did write an educator guide for that one and Lifting as We Climb, and then Dr. Sonia Cherry Paul wrote one for Stamped, and I have one as well. So you can click on some of these links. The last one is just, there's a little article about The Crucible, Challenging the Classics, where I wanted folks to just really think about the blind adoption of The Crucible, you know, and how much time are we spending reading The Crucible when we might be looking at some of the newer texts that have been published, getting our students to read them too, and then gathering their thoughts and opinions about whether these books would be good for maybe next year's students who are going to come into their class to read and study as part of the curriculum. Those are questions that I would ask.
Mm-hmm. So many great resources.
All right, so let's talk about opportunities, the story makers. What opportunities are there for young people to create stories? I love this picture of the Librarian of Congress with Jackie Woodson and Jason Reynolds. It says, Reynolds is telling the reader that he sees them. Woodson told me, this is the life he knows, the world he knows, and it's the truth, and therefore it's legit. This is from the recent article where Jacqueline Woodson is talking about Jason Reynolds and talking about how really he is one of many examples of folks who came up in a system that did not really embrace them in the way that we have the potential to do these days when we know about things like curriculum violence. And he became a writer for young people. Ideally, we want that for our young people in schools today. We should want that they could, if they want to, potentially see themselves as future creators of stories for other young people.
And I love that because, you know, I have to say, like this, I probably visit at least, you know, community book clubs and spaces, but also students and youth who are at, you know, some of our youth shelters, some of our places like our mental health support area for Denver. And every time I book talk a Jason Reynolds book, or I play some of his audiobook from like Long Way Down and When I Was the Greatest, it's like every student is like, I need a copy of that, miss. Can I get a copy of that book? And I'm like, yes, yes. All the response, all the love. So
yeah, when students love what they're reading, they're more likely to see themselves as potential writers, right? When they love it, not when they're tolerating it, not when they're getting through it so they can get a grade, not when they're doing it because they know that you want them to, but when they love it, that's the idea, right? And we want to reinforce that idea that their excellence is within them, going back to Dr. Goldie Bahamid's work. You know, the excellence is within them rather than look at this amazing example of excellent writing. You will never be like this. Or we hope that you will be like this, but this story has nothing to do with you. And this is not the way that you talk or think or write, you know? So we want to encourage our students to speak their truth and advocate for themselves and their communities.
yes, I love it.
And here are some ways, you know, they're creating amazing stories on TikTok. I have seen them. So I think that bringing that into the classroom is one way that students can tell stories. And then 826 National and Shout Mouse Press, 826 Digital, and Write the World are some more ways that students can be published. And bringing these in as exemplar texts, I think is really powerful too, because we can honestly say, this is what was written by young people about the world that you all are living in. Read this, and then let's talk about it. Bringing those into the classroom, I think is really powerful. And the library.
Yes, I love it.
Yeah. And so we kind of already talked about this, and we talked about how important it is. These folks were, all the writers of these books were not necessarily folks who saw the school system as a place where they could thrive. I remember specifically hearing Elizabeth Acevedo and Tommy Orange talk about how not only were they not encouraged to thrive in the school system, but they were like actually, you know, oppressed by it. So I think that ideally, if we don't want to create an environment that is oppressive for young people, then we have to bring in these stories that will grab them and then say, you know, not, look, this person survived school and look what they did. But no, I want to create an environment where you can thrive and do something like this too, should you choose.
I love it. And I also love whenever I'm sharing these books, is also sharing some of the videos and some of the YouTubes from the author. So it's just great for students to get to know the authors and the creators who look like them and had similar experiences to them.
Yeah, so, you know, we can just kind of go through this one quickly. Think about nostalgia and tradition and the role that plays in choosing texts or supporting students in choosing texts. Does one group of stakeholders make all or most of the decisions about the books that students engage with or spend the most time with? And then do you ask students how they're responding to their choices and seek out their input? That's something that's super important to do. I loved doing the quarterly check-in where I would ask the question, did you actually read this book? You're not going to get in trouble, just tell me the truth. Did you read this book cover to cover? And then did you learn from it? That's also another question that I really like asking, because then it helps inform the decisions that we make going forward.
I love it. And also just giving an opportunity to say, if should this book continue to be part of this practice? Is there a text that you would recommend that we've done through our book clubs, that your book club loved, that you saw a student who might not have envisioned themselves as a reader, all of a sudden it resonated with them, and now can we add that to our classroom curriculum or practice so that we can ensure these texts are centered and that students are all having that kind of connection and relationship with the books. So we're going to go into It Takes a Village. Who are the people in your neighborhood?
I know my bell is going to ring any minute, so I'm going to just kind of rush through this one. The leftmost picture are my two senior student assistants from 2 years ago. There it is. You're going to hear a lot of stomping and running here momentarily. And then in the middle is Mr. Barrientos, and he helps our SPED students at one of our schools, and he loves coming to the library and picking out books, and he found this one, They Call Me Güero, and he was like, oh my gosh, that's me, because he looks like Güero, and then he also is Mexican American, so he really identified with that book, and I think it's just like amazing to have a mirror book for our adult readers in the school settings as well. And then that's Mr. Frank reading All American Boys. He's so dope. He was the statistics teacher, and he also came through the library on a regular basis to get books. So I think that it is super important to encourage all folks to engage with books of their choice from classroom libraries and also from school libraries, not just the folks who are involved with the humanities. And this is just the ILA, Children's Rights to Read. I ordered about 10 copies of these for the teachers who regularly come through the library so that they can put that up in their classrooms and just remember that our children have the right to read, to have access, to choose what they read, to have the windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors that we've talked about, to read for pleasure, to have a supportive reading environment, to have that time set aside for reading. And then number 8 is really important because I think that we underestimate that one. How do young people share what they read and learn about? And then they have the right to read, to springboard other forms of communication, such as writing creatively, not just for informational purposes or for argumentative purposes, but creatively as well, to express themselves. And then they have the right to benefit from our support financially and, in all kinds of ways. Mm-hmm. So we can just kind of go through this very quickly. This is a slide, this and the next one are slides from surveys that I give to my students. And I'm hopeful that the statistics will look different when I do them with the students right now, but I do them at the very beginning of the year, just to try to gather this data. And then throughout the year, I will share this with folks on staff to help them see the culture of reading. And you can see 285 people were in the middle. They didn't think that reading was super boring or super amazing. So to me, that says 285 people could be swayed to the 4 and 5 side. And it seems like, there's work that we could do there to move folks to a place where they actually feel that reading is great, like 134 people did. Mm-hmm. And we can skip this because that's exactly what I just said. Okay.
Awesome. And on the last slide are just some examples of some of the community outreach that we do. We have a Black Dad story time. We think about how do we activate community, not just as readers, but also as the storytellers. And so we have a group of fathers that comes together and offers wonderful, beautiful programming for our families. We also have a Black to Nature book club in our district. So we have families that gather in nature to read and to be a part of a reading community. We also activate poets and graphic artists and muralists in our community to connect students with their artwork so that our students can write poetry. And so there's a small poetry slam. And then we do a lot of partnerships with all of our different book clubs. We have a little persons group. We have Light of Children through our BCDI families work. And then we have the 5280 Black Lives Matter. We present for their summer workshops and camps. And so we just want to create those experiences that are so positive and so joyful that kids continually want to come back and be in that space where books are centered and book joy is life.
I mean, I kind of want a mic drop right there and just end it with what you just said. But I also want to add that, you know, when we're thinking about where we find stories, we want to consider stories that are part of the textual lineage in our community. So what are the groups in your community? And ask elders, ask adults, what is some of their textual lineage? What are some of the stories that they have loved? And then make connections between those and some of the newer stories that are being written about these days. And then what are stories that shape identity formation in your community? And then I love, for the last one, stories that imagine the world as we would like it to be. I love Foja Singh Keeps Going because that is such a beautiful story about an elder in a community that was uplifted and celebrated and recognized. And that's the kind of world that I want to see. We don't usually, there are, you know, many places in America specifically that don't honor our elders as we should. So I love that story in particular for, you know, teaching that lesson about the world as we might like it to be with respect to our elders.
Yes. Ah, our elders.
Okay. So if you have any questions, you can find us on Le Twitter, but also we will be tweeting throughout the day. We'll be checking in with different Ed Collab members. And we are, you know, we are in Denver Public Schools. I feel like there's an announcement, so I'm going to mute.
Yes, so don't forget to use the hashtag, the Ed Collab. I'll just put it on the screen one more time. So the Ed Collab gathering. So enjoy.